I never expected my morning coffee to be interrupted by someone stealing parts off my truck, but that's exactly what happened on a Tuesday morning in suburban Phoenix, Arizona. My name is Ethan Vance, and I had just moved into the Sunnyside Ridge community 6 months ago. The neighborhood seemed perfect at first, with its manicured lawns, palm trees lining every street, and houses that all looked like they belonged in a home improvement magazine. What I didn't know was that the homeowners association was run by someone who treated the neighborhood covenants like they were federal law, and her name was Sharon Pettinger. Sharon was in her mid-40s, with that distinctive haircut that screamed for a manager at every establishment. You know the one, short in the back, longer and angled in the front, usually highlighted blonde. She drove a white Lexus SUV and wore designer sunglasses even when it was cloudy. She lived 3 houses down from me and had been the HOA president for the past 7 years, which should have been my first red flag when I was house hunting. That Tuesday morning started like any other. I woke up at 6:30, made my coffee, and was about to head out to my job at the construction management firm downtown when I noticed something was off with my truck. I had a 2023 Ford F-150, graphite gray, which I had customized with a few aftermarket additions including a high-end remote starter system I had installed just 3 weeks ago. The system cost me $850 and included a 2-way remote with a range of up to a mile. I loved that thing because Arizona summers are brutal, and being able to start my truck and get the air conditioning running from inside my house was a game changer. As I walked toward my truck in the driveway, I noticed my hood was slightly ajar. My stomach dropped. I rushed over and lifted it completely, and that's when I saw it. The remote starter module was gone. Not just disconnected, completely removed. The wiring harness had been cut, and whoever did it knew what they were doing because they had taken the bypass module and the antenna too. I stood there for a moment trying to process what I was seeing. Who steals a remote starter? I looked around the neighborhood, and that's when I saw her. Sharon was in her driveway, loading something into the back of her Lexus. She looked over at me, and our eyes met for just a second before she quickly got into her vehicle and drove off. Something about that interaction felt wrong. The timing was too convenient, and the way she hurried away raised every red flag in my mind. I went back inside and called the non-emergency police line to report the theft. They said they would send an officer out to take a report. Officer Martinez arrived about 45 minutes later. He was a middle-aged Hispanic man with a professional demeanor who took my statement seriously. I showed him the damage under the hood and explained what was missing. He took photos and wrote everything down. "You have any idea who might have done this?" he asked. I hesitated. I don't want to accuse anyone without proof, but my HOA president was acting really strange this morning. She was loading something into her car and took off as soon as she saw me looking at my truck. Officer Martinez raised an eyebrow. "HOA president? What's her name?" "Sharon Pettinger. She lives at 4127 Desert Bloom Drive." He wrote it down. "Any previous issues with her?" That's when I remembered. Actually, yes. About 2 weeks ago, she left a violation notice on my door because I had my truck parked in the driveway instead of the garage. The notice said it was unsightly and violated the community aesthetics clause. I wrote back explaining that my garage is full of tools and equipment I use for work, and according to the actual HOA rules, I'm allowed to park one vehicle in my driveway as long as it's in good condition and not commercial. She wasn't happy about that. Officer Martinez nodded. "Okay, I'm going to go have a conversation with her. Stay here and I'll let you know what I find out." I waited at home, calling my boss to explain why I would be late. He was understanding, thankfully. About an hour later, Officer Martinez called me and asked me to come down to the station. His voice had changed, taking on a more serious tone that made my pulse quicken. When I arrived at the Phoenix Police Department's North Valley precinct, Officer Martinez met me in the lobby and led me back to a small room. On the table was a clear plastic evidence bag, and inside it was my remote starter module, the bypass module, the antenna, and my remote control unit. "Is this your property?" he asked. I leaned forward, examining it. "Yes, that's definitely mine. Where did you find it?" Officer Martinez sat down across from me. "In Sharon Pettinger's garage. She admitted to taking it." My mouth fell open. "She what?" When I went to her house and asked about the incident, she initially denied everything. But when I mentioned that theft of auto parts is a serious crime, she got defensive and said she was just enforcing HOA rules. She claimed that aftermarket modifications to vehicles aren't allowed under the community covenants, and that she had the right to remove them. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She thought she had the right to steal parts off my truck because of HOA rules. Apparently so. When I informed her that what she did constitutes theft and potentially vehicle theft charges depending on the value of the items, she became very agitated. She kept insisting that as HOA president, she has authority to enforce the rules by any means necessary. Officer Martinez shook his head. "I've seen HOA disputes before, but this is a first." "What happens now?" I asked. "Well, here's the thing. In Arizona, theft of vehicle parts or accessories valued over $500 can be classified under vehicle theft statutes, which is a Class 5 felony. Your remote starter system cost $850 according to your receipt, correct?" "Yes, that's right." "Miss Pettinger is being processed right now. She's been arrested and will be charged with theft. The prosecutor's office will determine the exact charges, but this is definitely criminal." I sat back in my chair, trying to wrap my head around the situation. I just wanted my parts back. I didn't think this would turn into a felony case. Officer Martinez gave me a sympathetic look. "Mr. Vance, she committed a crime. Whether you wanted to press charges or not, once we discovered stolen property and she admitted to taking it, we have to proceed. Plus, she showed no remorse. She actually told me that she plans to do the same thing to other residents who violate HOA rules, in her opinion." That last part sent a chill down my spine. Other residents. Has she done this before? She didn't provide specifics, but I'm going to be following up with the HOA board and other residents to see if there have been similar incidents. You might not be the only victim here. Over the next few days, the story exploded in our little community. It turned out that Sharon had been terrorizing residents for years, though nothing quite as extreme as stealing car parts. One neighbor, a retired teacher named Dorothy, told me that Sharon had once removed her mailbox because it was 2 inches taller than the HOA specifications allowed. Another resident, a young couple with a newborn, said Sharon had filed formal complaints because their baby's crying could be heard from the street, and she considered it a noise violation. The more I learned, the more I realized that Sharon's theft of my remote starter was just the culmination of years of escalating behavior. She had started with strongly worded letters, moved on to fines that had questionable legal standing, and apparently decided that taking matters into her own hands was the next logical step. The HOA board held an emergency meeting 3 days after Sharon's arrest. I attended along with about 40 other residents, which was apparently the largest turnout they had ever had. The meeting was held in the community center, a small building near the entrance of the neighborhood that usually hosted book clubs and yoga classes. The board consisted of 5 people including Sharon, though obviously she wasn't present. The vice president, a man in his 60s named Robert Chen, ran the meeting. He looked exhausted and deeply embarrassed. "First, I want to apologize on behalf of the board," Robert began, his voice heavy. "We were aware that Sharon could be overzealous in her enforcement of the HOA rules, but we had no idea she would cross the line into criminal behavior. This is unacceptable and does not represent the values of our community." A woman in the back raised her hand. "How did it get this far?" "Didn't anyone notice she was out of control?" Robert sighed. "In hindsight, yes, there were signs. But Sharon was very good at presenting her actions as being in the best interest of the community. She would cite property values, neighborhood reputation, and the importance of maintaining standards. Some of her concerns were legitimate, but her methods became increasingly extreme." "What's going to happen to her?" someone else asked. "She's been immediately removed from the board," Robert replied. "As for the criminal case, that's up to the justice system." "I spoke with her attorney this morning, and apparently she still believes she did nothing wrong. She thinks that her role as HOA president gave her legal authority to enforce rules by confiscating property." I stood up, and everyone turned to look at me. Most of them knew who I was by now since my truck had been the subject of Sharon's crime. "Has anyone else had property taken or tampered with?" The room was silent for a moment. Then a man in his 30s raised his hand tentatively. "I thought I was going crazy, but my garden gnome disappeared about a month ago. I had it in my front yard, and one day it was just gone. I assumed some kids took it as a prank. Sharon left me a violation notice about garden decorations being tacky about a week before it disappeared." Another voice added. It was a woman I didn't recognize, probably early 40s. "I ignored the notice because garden decorations aren't prohibited in the rules." More hands started going up. Someone's welcome mat had vanished. Another person's basketball hoop had been mysteriously damaged. A third resident said their political yard sign had been removed during election season. As the stories came out, a picture emerged of Sharon systematically taking or destroying property she deemed violations of her personal interpretation of HOA rules. Robert looked increasingly distressed. "I think everyone who has experienced anything like this needs to file a report with the police. If there are other victims, the prosecutor needs to know." The meeting continued for another hour, with the board discussing how they would move forward. They decided to hire a property management company to handle HOA matters going forward, and they planned to review all of the rules to make sure they were reasonable and clearly written. They also voted to use some of the HOA funds to offer me compensation for the time and stress I had experienced, though I told them it wasn't necessary. The real issue was making sure Sharon faced consequences and that this never happened again. After the meeting, several neighbors came up to me and apologized, which I found strange since they hadn't done anything wrong. But they explained that they had heard Sharon complaining about my truck at various neighborhood gatherings and hadn't thought much of it. They felt guilty for not speaking up or warning me. "She made it sound like you were being difficult and disrespectful to the community," Dorothy told me. "She had this way of painting people as villains if they didn't go along with everything she wanted. I'm sorry I didn't see through it sooner." I assured her it wasn't her fault, and we ended up talking for a while about the neighborhood and how things would change now. Despite the circumstances, it felt good to actually connect with my neighbors. Before this incident, I had been so focused on work and settling into my new house that I hadn't really gotten to know anyone, besides polite waves and brief conversations about the weather. The legal process moved forward over the following weeks. Sharon was officially charged with 1 count of theft of vehicle parts, a Class 5 felony in Arizona, because the value exceeded $500. She was also charged with multiple counts of misdemeanor theft for the other items residents reported stolen. The prosecutor's office took the case seriously because they said it represented an abuse of a position of trust within the community. I had to give a deposition, which was tedious but necessary. The prosecutor, a sharp woman in her 40s named Assistant District Attorney Rebecca Walsh, explained that Sharon's attorney was trying to argue that she had genuinely believed she was acting within her authority as HOA president. The problem with that defense, Ada Walsh told me during a prep meeting, is that no reasonable person would believe an HOA president has the right to enter private property and remove items from vehicles, regardless of any rules or covenants. Plus, we have documentation showing that multiple people told her she was overstepping, including the HOA attorney who resigned last year specifically because she refused to listen to his legal advice. There was an HOA attorney who quit because of her, I asked. Yes. We tracked him down, and he's willing to testify that he repeatedly told Sharon she could not enforce rules through property confiscation or destruction. He told her the HOA could levy fines through proper procedures and could place liens on properties for unpaid fines, but that was the extent of their power. She apparently told him he was being too soft and that the community needed stronger leadership. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks after Sharon's arrest. I attended along with several other residents. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, nothing like the dramatic spaces you see on TV. Sharon sat at the defense table with her attorney, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit who kept whispering to her. She looked composed but angry, her jaw set in a hard line. The hearing was mostly procedural. The prosecutor presented the basic facts of the case, and Sharon's attorney argued that the charges should be reduced because there was no criminal intent. The judge, a stern-looking woman in her 50s, wasn't buying it. "Counselor, your client admitted to taking property that didn't belong to her," the judge said. "Intent to permanently deprive the owner of that property is evident in the fact that she removed it and stored it in her own garage. Whether she believed she had authority to do so is irrelevant to the question of whether a crime was committed." Sharon's attorney tried to argue more, but the judge cut him off and ruled that there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. A trial date was set for 3 months later. In the meantime, life in the neighborhood started to return to normal, or at least a new version of normal. The property management company took over, and they were professional and reasonable. Violation notices were rare, and only sent for genuine issues like someone's trash cans being left at the curb for days. The atmosphere in the community felt lighter somehow, like everyone could breathe easier without Sharon's constant surveillance and criticism. I had my remote starter reinstalled, which cost me another $200 in labor because Sharon's removal had damaged some of the wiring. I kept the receipts for everything, as Ada Walsh said I could request restitution as part of Sharon's sentence if she was convicted. I also became friends with several of my neighbors during this time. Robert Chen and I started having coffee occasionally on weekend mornings. He told me more about the history of the HOA and how Sharon had gradually consolidated power over the years. "When I first moved here 10 years ago, the board was much more balanced," Robert explained. "We had 5 people with different perspectives, and decisions were made collectively. But Sharon was so passionate and dedicated, or so we thought, that people started deferring to her. One by one, the other board members either moved away or stepped down, and Sharon made sure the people who replaced them were either allies or too passive to challenge her. "How did you end up staying on the board?" I asked. "Honestly, stubbornness," he said with a wry smile. "I knew she was going too far, but I thought I could be a moderating influence. I see now that I should have done more to stop her, or at least speak out more forcefully. I feel responsible for what happened to you and the others." "You can't control other people's actions," I told him. "Sharon made her choices." "I know, but still. I'm retiring from the board after this year. I think the neighborhood needs fresh perspectives, people who will work together instead of being dominated by one person's vision." The trial finally arrived in late October. Arizona weather was finally starting to cool down, which was a relief after a brutal summer. I took time off work to attend, and the courtroom was packed with residents from Sunnyside Ridge. Apparently, our case had gotten some media attention as a cautionary tale about HOA overreach, and there were a few reporters present as well. Sharon's defense strategy became clear during opening statements. Her attorney argued that while Sharon may have used poor judgment, she truly believed she was acting within her authority and was trying to protect property values for all residents. He painted her as a dedicated volunteer who gave countless hours to the community and made a mistake born of excessive zeal rather than criminal intent. The prosecution's opening statement was more straightforward. Ada Walsh laid out a timeline of escalating behavior, documented warnings Sharon had received, and the clear evidence that she knowingly took property that didn't belong to her. Walsh emphasized that the law doesn't provide an HOA exception for theft. I was called to testify on the second day of the trial. I was nervous, having never testified in court before, but Ada Walsh had prepared me well. I explained what happened the morning I discovered my remote starter missing, identified the property that had been recovered, and confirmed the value of the system. Sharon's attorney cross-examined me, trying to establish that I had been antagonistic toward Sharon and the HOA rules. "Isn't it true, Mr. Vance, that you repeatedly refused to comply with parking guidelines?" "No, that's not true," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "I parked my truck in my driveway, which is explicitly allowed under the HOA covenants." I provided a copy of the relevant section to Sharon when she first complained. "But you knew she found it objectionable." "Yes, but her personal opinion doesn't override the written rules that I agreed to when I purchased my home." The attorney moved on to questions about the remote starter. "Isn't it true that this modification made your vehicle louder and more noticeable?" "No. A remote starter doesn't affect the sound of the vehicle at all. It just allows me to start it from a distance, so the air conditioning can cool it down before I get in." He tried a few more angles, but nothing seemed to land effectively. I was excused after about 30 minutes on the stand. Other residents testified about their experiences with Sharon. The man whose garden gnome had disappeared testified that Sharon had told him directly that she had handled the problem when he mentioned it to her at a neighborhood gathering, though she refused to elaborate. The woman whose basketball hoop had been damaged testified that Sharon had sent her a letter threatening escalating enforcement actions if the hoop wasn't removed, even though the HOA rules allowed basketball hoops. The most damning testimony came from the former HOA attorney, Douglas Freeman. He was a distinguished-looking man in his 70s who had practiced real estate law for 40 years. He testified that he had served as the HOA's legal counsel for 3 years before resigning. "Why did you resign?" Ada Walsh asked. "Because Sharon Pettinger repeatedly refused to follow my legal advice," he said clearly. "I told her on no less than 6 occasions that the HOA's enforcement powers were limited to fines, liens, and civil court actions. I specifically told her that she could not confiscate property, enter private property without permission, or take any self-help measures to enforce rules. How did she respond to this advice? She told me I didn't understand the community and that sometimes decisive action was necessary. She said that if the HOA rules weren't enforced strictly, property values would plummet and the neighborhood would fall apart. When I told her that her proposed actions could result in personal liability or even criminal charges, she laughed and said that no one would ever prosecute an HOA president for caring too much about their community. That statement hung in the air. Several jurors visibly reacted. Sharon's attorney tried to rehabilitate the situation during his cross-examination. "Mr. Freeman, isn't it possible that Miss Pettinger simply had a different interpretation of the HOA's powers?" "No," Freeman said firmly. "The law is quite clear on this matter. There is no reasonable interpretation under which an HOA president has the right to take property from residents. This isn't a gray area." The prosecution rested after 3 days of testimony. Sharon's defense was brief. They called a few character witnesses who testified that Sharon was a devoted community member who volunteered for various causes and had always seemed to have the neighborhood's best interests at heart. Sharon herself testified, which surprised me. On the stand, Sharon was composed but defiant. She maintained that she had been trying to protect the community and that she had believed her actions were justified. "I spent 7 years building this neighborhood into something we could all be proud of," she said. "Property values increased 23% during my tenure as president. I did what I thought was necessary to maintain our standards." "Did you take Mr. Vance's remote starter from his vehicle?" her attorney asked. "I removed an unauthorized modification that was not in compliance with community standards, yes." "Did you intend to steal from him?" "Absolutely not. I intended to hold the item until he agreed to comply with the rules. I would have returned it once the matter was resolved." On cross-examination, Ada Walsh dismantled that argument. "Miss Pettinger, where in the HOA covenants does it say that remote starters are prohibited?" Sharon hesitated. "They aren't specifically mentioned, but the general provisions about maintaining community aesthetics and standards would apply. A remote starter is installed inside the vehicle and isn't visible from the outside. How does it affect community aesthetics?" "The vehicle was being started remotely and left running unattended in the driveway. That creates noise and disturbance." Mr. Vance testified that he would start his truck approximately 5 minutes before leaving for work, and the vehicle is no louder when started remotely than when started normally. "Did you ever actually measure the noise level or receive any complaints from other residents about it?" "No, but that doesn't mean it wasn't a problem." Walsh pressed on. "You testified that you intended to return the remote starter once the matter was resolved. What did you mean by that?" "Once Mr. Vance agreed to park in his garage instead of the driveway, I would have returned the device." "So you were holding his property hostage to force compliance with a rule that doesn't actually exist in the HOA covenants?" "That's not how I would characterize it." "How would you characterize taking someone's property without permission and refusing to return it unless they do what you want?" Sharon's attorney objected, but the damage was done. Sharon had essentially admitted to using the theft as leverage, which undermined her entire defense that she had been acting in good faith. Closing arguments happened on the 4th day of trial. Sharon's attorney did his best to portray his client as a well-meaning volunteer who made a mistake in judgment, but didn't have criminal intent. Ada Walsh argued that the evidence clearly showed Sharon knew what she was doing was wrong, had been warned repeatedly, and did it anyway because she believed she was above the rules she claimed to be enforcing. The jury deliberated for about 5 hours. When they returned, the forewoman read the verdict. Guilty on the felony theft charge. Guilty on 4 of the 6 misdemeanor theft charges related to other residents' property. Not guilty on 2 of the misdemeanors where the evidence was less clear. Sharon's face went pale. Her attorney put a hand on her shoulder. The judge set a sentencing hearing for 3 weeks later and allowed Sharon to remain free on bail until then. The sentencing hearing was more emotionally charged. Several residents gave victim impact statements, describing how Sharon's behavior had made them feel unsafe in their own homes and had created an atmosphere of fear in the neighborhood. I gave a statement too, explaining that while the monetary value of my stolen property wasn't life-changing, the violation of having someone tamper with my vehicle was significant. I also noted the time and stress involved in the legal process. Sharon's attorney argued for a suspended sentence and probation, emphasizing that Sharon had no prior criminal record and had done a lot of good for the community over the years. He presented letters from various people attesting to her volunteer work and positive contributions. Ada Walsh argued for jail time, stating that Sharon had shown no genuine remorse and had used her position of authority to victimize multiple people. Walsh noted that Sharon still maintained she had been justified in her actions, which suggested she would likely reoffend if given the chance. The judge took a day to consider before issuing her sentence. When we returned to court, she addressed Sharon directly. "Miss Pettinger, you held a position of trust in your community, and you abused that trust in a systematic way. You were warned repeatedly that your actions were illegal, and you chose to ignore those warnings. You showed no respect for your neighbor's property rights or for the rule of law. While I acknowledge that you have done some positive things for your community, that does not excuse criminal behavior." The judge sentenced Sharon to 1 year in county jail, with 6 months suspended, meaning she would serve 6 months if she maintained good behavior. She also received 3 years of probation, was ordered to pay restitution to all victims, and was prohibited from serving on any HOA board during her probation. Additionally, she was required to complete 100 hours of community service after her release, though not in any capacity related to homeowner associations. Sharon was taken into custody immediately. As the bailiff led her away, she looked back at the courtroom with an expression that was hard to read. It wasn't quite regret, but maybe the beginning of understanding that her actions had consequences. Outside the courthouse, several of my neighbors and I stood in the afternoon sun, processing what had just happened. Robert Chen looked relieved but also sad. "I never wanted to come to this," he said, "but maybe this is what needed to happen for the neighborhood to heal." Dorothy, the retired teacher, nodded. "Sometimes people need to face real consequences before they can understand the impact of their behavior. Maybe Sharon will get help while she's serving her time." The media coverage of the case ended up being pretty extensive. Local news ran several stories about HOA overreach and the importance of understanding the limits of HOA authority. A few national outlets picked it up as an unusual interest piece. Our neighborhood became a cautionary tale, which was embarrassing but also sparked important conversations. In the months that followed, Sunnyside Ridge underwent significant changes. The new property management company worked with the board to revise the HOA rules, making them clearer and more reasonable. They eliminated several vague provisions that Sharon had used to justify her actions, and added explicit language about enforcement procedures and resident rights. The board also implemented a new system where any violation notice had to be reviewed by at least 2 board members before being sent, and residents were given a clear appeals process. They brought in the new attorney to conduct a training session for all residents about HOA law and what the association could and couldn't do. Property values didn't plummet, as Sharon had always warned they would if enforcement wasn't strict. In fact, the neighborhood became more desirable because people appreciated the more reasonable approach to community management. Several houses sold during this period, and the new residents were pleased to hear about the reforms. I ended up serving on the HOA board myself for a year, elected by residents who felt I understood the importance of balance between maintaining community standards and respecting individual rights. It was more work than I expected, but also rewarding to help shape the community in a positive direction. Sharon was released from jail after serving 4.5 months with good behavior. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she had moved to a different part of Phoenix and was living in an apartment complex. According to someone who ran into her at a grocery store, she seemed subdued and avoided talking about her time in Sunnyside Ridge. I hoped that meant she was reflecting on what had happened and maybe getting some perspective, but I didn't know for sure. The restitution payments came through without issue. I received full compensation for the cost of my remote starter system, the additional labor to reinstall it, and a small amount for my time dealing with the case. Other victims received similar restitution. It didn't erase what had happened, but it was something. About a year after the trial, I was washing my truck in my driveway on a Saturday morning when a car pulled up. I didn't recognize the vehicle at first, but then the driver got out and I saw it was Sharon. My first instinct was to be on guard, but she held up her hands in a placating gesture. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she said. "I just wanted to talk to you for a minute if that's okay." I turned off the hose and walked over, keeping a respectful distance. "Okay." She looked different than I remembered. The sharp, aggressive edge was gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine exhaustion. I wanted to apologize. I know I'm supposed to stay away from the neighborhood as part of my probation, but my probation officer approved this visit because I'm working through my actions in therapy and making amends is part of that process. I didn't say anything, just waited for her to continue. "I spent a lot of time thinking about what happened while I was in jail," she said. "I convinced myself that I was doing the right thing, that I was protecting the neighborhood, but the truth is, I was on a power trip. I like being in charge and having control, and when people didn't do what I wanted, I escalated instead of stepping back." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because you were right and I was wrong. I stole your property. I violated your trust and the trust of a lot of other people. No amount of justification about HOA rules makes that okay. I'm sorry for what I did to you and for the stress and time it cost you." I studied her face, trying to determine if this was genuine or just another manipulation. She seemed sincere, but I had learned to be cautious. "I appreciate you saying that. I also wanted you to know that I'm paying restitution not just because the court ordered it, but because it's the right thing to do. I caused real harm to real people, and I need to own that." We stood there for a moment in awkward silence. "Are you doing okay?" I finally asked. She let out a short laugh. "That's generous of you to ask. I'm managing. I lost a lot, my reputation, my position in the community, my sense of identity, honestly. But I'm working with a therapist to understand why I became so obsessed with control and how to be a better person going forward. I have a long way to go." "Well, I hope you figure it out," I said, and I meant it. I wasn't going to forget what she had done, but I also didn't see the point in holding on to anger forever. "Thank you. I won't take up any more of your time." She started to walk back to her car, then paused. "For what it's worth, you were right about the parking situation. I looked up the rules again after everything happened. You were completely within your rights. I just didn't want to admit I was wrong. She got in her car and drove away. I stood there for a while, processing the encounter. It didn't change what had happened, but it did provide some closure. Life in Sunnyside Ridge continued to improve. The new board worked well together, making decisions collaboratively, and always keeping the community's best interests in mind without trampling on individual rights. Neighborhood gatherings became actual social events instead of forums for Sharon to lecture people about violations. I kept my remote starter and continued parking my truck in the driveway. No one ever complained. In fact, when I installed a new sound system in my truck a few months later, my neighbor 2 doors down asked me who did the installation work because he wanted to upgrade his vehicle too. It was a normal, friendly interaction, the kind of thing that should have always been possible. The whole experience taught me a lot about the importance of checks and balances, even in small community organizations. It also showed me that sometimes standing up for yourself is necessary, even when it seems easier to just go along with unreasonable demands. If I had simply moved my truck into the garage and given up my remote starter to appease Sharon, she would have continued her behavior and probably escalated with other residents. I also learned that communities are stronger when people actually communicate with each other, rather than relying on one person to make all the decisions. The friendships I built with my neighbors during and after the incident enriched my life in ways I hadn't expected. Robert, Dorothy, and several others became genuine friends, people I could call for help or just to hang out with. 2 years after the initial incident, I was promoted at work and decided to celebrate by upgrading my truck. I traded in my F-150 for a new one with an even better remote starter system, this time installed at the dealership, so it came with an excellent warranty. When I pulled into my driveway with the new truck, several neighbors came over to check it out and congratulate me on the promotion. "Nice truck," Robert said, walking around it admiringly. Sharon would have hated this. We all laughed, and it felt good to be able to joke about it. The incident had become part of the neighborhood's history, a story about what not to do and how things could change for the better. The HOA continued operating smoothly under the new management structure. Violations were handled appropriately when they occurred, such as when someone's lawn died during a particularly hot summer, and they were given resources and a reasonable timeline to address it rather than being hit with immediate fines. When actual problems arose, like someone starting a small business that generated significant traffic and parking issues, the board addressed it through proper channels, including mediation and working with the homeowner to find solutions. I eventually stepped down from the board after my 1-year term, feeling that I had contributed what I could and wanting to make room for other voices. A younger couple, new to the neighborhood, took my place and brought fresh energy and ideas. The community continued to evolve in positive ways. As for Sharon, I never saw her again after that morning when she came to apologize. I heard occasional updates through mutual acquaintances. She completed her probation successfully, finished her community service, and apparently maintained a low profile. Someone said she was working in retail management, which seemed like a decent fit for her skills as long as she had proper oversight. I sometimes wondered if she ever thought about the remote starter incident and how such a small thing had spiraled into such major consequences for her life. A device worth less than $1,000 had resulted in a criminal record, jail time, and the loss of everything she had built in the community. It was a stark reminder that our actions have consequences, and that positions of authority come with responsibilities, not unlimited power. The whole experience also changed how I thought about homeowner associations. I used to view them as just an annoying bureaucracy that came with buying a house in certain neighborhoods. Now I understood them as communities within communities, capable of great good when run properly, but also capable of serious harm when power goes unchecked. The rules and structures matter, but so do the people implementing them and the culture they create. My truck still sits in my driveway most days, remote starter working perfectly, keeping the interior cool during the brutal Arizona summers. Every time I use it, I'm reminded of the strange journey that started with a missing car part and ended with meaningful changes in my community. It's a reminder that standing up for what's right, even in small ways, can have ripple effects you never anticipated. The neighborhood continues to thrive, and I'm proud to be part of it. We have our challenges like any community, disputes about noise levels or architectural changes or how to handle community funds, but we address them like reasonable adults through proper channels. It's not always perfect, but it's functional and fair, which is really all you can ask for. Looking back, I never expected that moving to Sunnyside Ridge would involve police reports, criminal trials, and such dramatic confrontation. I had just wanted a nice house in a decent neighborhood with reasonable commute to work. What I got was much more complicated, but ultimately more meaningful. I found a community, made real friends, and learned valuable lessons about standing up for yourself and others. The remote starter theft incident became a defining moment not just for me, but for the entire neighborhood. It forced everyone to examine how the HOA operated and whether the systems in place were truly serving the community's interests. The answer was clearly no, and we made changes. That's something to be proud of. On warm evenings, I sometimes sit on my front porch and watch the neighborhood. Kids ride bikes down the street. Neighbors walk their dogs and chat with each other. People work on their yards or wash their cars without fear of unreasonable violations. It's peaceful and normal, the way it should be. And my truck sits in the driveway, remote starter intact, a quiet symbol of the fight for common sense and the importance of knowing that even HOA board members have limits to their authority. Limits that include respecting the law and their neighbors' property rights.